it's a worldwide precedent. The rating agency is not as untouchable as it used to be. So that's quite important for, well, the whole financial world.
In the US, the Department of Justice is seeking $5 billion in damages from rating agencies in the wake of the Australian case. Elsewhere, a multinational campaign is being masterminded from Sydney by this man.
In the UK, we're in the process of engaging people who have had similar losses.
Lawyer John Walker of Australia's largest litigation funder, IMF, financed the federal court action as a test case. Now he's backing the Netherlands action, then the UK's, before seeking damages from the rating agencies over the biggest investment disaster of them all, known as collateralised debt obligations.
There was in excess of $1 trillion lost in Europe as a result of collateralised debt obligations. And the majority of that would have been rated by those three rating agencies.
Montrose Access was established in 1933.
Victims who lost their investments in Australia include churches, councils and charities like Queensland's Montrose Access or the Crippled Children's Society.
We are currently providing service and support for approximately 600 families across Queensland.
The charity lost $3 million it had saved to upgrade facilities and services.
One of the reasons that we were confident in going into these investments was the very sound ratings that they did have. I think from memory they were AA and AAA.
In the federal court, Justice Jane Jago, in her landmark 580,000-word judgment, was scathing about S&P's competence and attacked its willingness to give in to ABN AMRO, which was paying S&P for rating debt securities it was trying to sell.
We intend to use almost all the evidence which is used in the Australian proceedings also here in the Netherlands.
Simply, the rating agencies got too close to the investment banks. There was a business motive to provide the rating to gain market growth.
Standard & Poor's says it will appeal Australia's federal court judgment holding S&P liable for losses arising from their ratings. And there's no guarantee the Dutch court will agree with the Australian decision. S&P has told 730 in a statement it has taken to heart the lessons learned from the financial crisis. We have spent $400 million to reinforce the integrity, independence and performance of our ratings. Others say the industry can't police itself.
This system is really, really bad. It's totally ineffective and it leads to crises.
Professor Imad Musa, former economist with the IMF, the US Treasury and the UN, says the agencies have a long and appalling track record, including unforeseen corporate collapses, the Asian financial crisis and worse.
The rating agencies contributed significantly to the global financial crisis and also to the European financial crisis. People lost their jobs, they lost their homes. Immense damage.
So how big a damages bill then could the rating agencies face? Could this send them broke?
That's not our objective.
Some, however, hope it does.
I hope that these litigations that are going to go now will bring them down to their knees. I'm actually still surprised that they are still in business, and I think the world will be a better place without them.
Seeing memo that was released today, it was covered on Infowars.com. It was written by Greg Palast. And the title of it is The Confidential Memo at the Heart of the Global Financial Crisis. And what he points out is that he got this memo sent to him from somebody. He says, when a little birdie dropped in the end game memo, is what he calls it, through my window, its content was so explosive, so sick, and just plain evil he couldn't believe it. But he actually did go through and verify it. And this is what's interesting about it. The players, The Treasury official playing the banker's secret endgame was Larry Summers. And of course, Larry Summers is Obama's choice to become chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve. And if the memo is authentic, he says, then Summers shouldn't be going to the Fed. He should be going to the prison. But he verified it as being authentic. And the interesting thing about this memo is that it is from Timothy Geithner, who was a leading player at the Federal Reserve in New York during the TARP fiasco, and is now Treasury Secretary under Obama. And this is what the memo said. It said, as we enter the end game of the World Trade Organization financial services negotiation, I would believe it would be a good idea for you to touch base with CEOs. He sent this to Larry Summers, and he points out here that if Larry Summers had called him, that would have triggered, under U.S. law, a public law. So what he does is he puts the phone numbers of the people, these few bankers that he wants to get involved in there. Of course, one of them is the criminal John Corzine. And the whole point of this was to, the end game essentially was to deregulate the banks with Glass-Steagall and to allow them to create these financial derivative markets, which, as he points out, J.P. Morgan would soon after this memo have an $88 trillion pseudo security on their books, because of course those derivatives are not worth that much money. They can claim that they're worth that much money, and then they go around to different countries and tell them that they need to be bailed out or else. And then once the countries do that, then they declare those countries financially insolvent, lower their credit ratings, and then take over their countries, as we've seen time and again. In Italy and in Greece, we see Goldman Sachs people being put in positions of power and taking out democratically elected leaders.
Greg Palast, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Greg Palast is the New York Times best-selling author of Billionaires and Ballot Bandits, Vulture's Picnic, Armed Madhouse, and The Best Democracy Money Can Buy. Greg Palast is also a freelance investigative journalist for the BBC. He's written for Rolling Stone, The Observer, and most recently Vice magazine. Greg, as an investigative journalist, much of your work is reliant on informants, squealers, whistleblowers, canaries, finks, and tattletales.
Snitches.
Snitches.
No, I mean, look, Obama ran on the platform that, we need whistleblowers to keep government honest, and I will protect them. So ask Private Manning about the protections for outing unbelievable evils. It never endangered anyone, but endangered lots of corporate profits. In fact, his material actually saved lives. No one's really brought that out. And Snowden, same thing. But, I don't see where the protection is. I don't see where the protection is in that sense. So at least by bringing in the foreigners, whether it's BBC, Al Jazeera, RT, whatever in America, and of course, you may bitch about it, but Canadian broadcasting is like manna from the spectrum that falls upon us if we can get it into the U.S., but rarely do. The memo, I think you're about to ask me about something called the Endgame memo, and let me tell you, because it is a State Department diplomatic secret cable, it falls in the same exact category as WikiLeaks, and therefore as the WikiLeaks documents, which are State Department cables. So technically,
it's espionage.
It's another espionage situation. And technically, I could be charged, and certainly my source could be charged with releasing that information. But therefore, I go way out of my way to protect people, and I wish journalists would do more of that. The problem with the U.S. journalists is that they don't do it at all. U.S. journalists will not take inside information for the most part.
Il faut le jeu de la concurrence, parce que ce qui est drôle, c'est qu'une idée comme ça qui jaillit et qui reflète la vérité même n'est pas prise au sérieux, n'est pas acceptée. Et c'est ça, alors dans ces cas-là, on est obligé d'aller frapper à toutes les portes. Mais quand on sait que, tiens, tel gouvernement a envoyé telle mission à tel endroit, c'est le rôle des ambassadeurs d'ailleurs, qui suivent toutes les délégations qui sortent, qui partent, parce que quand une délégation va faire un voyage dans un autre pays, l'ambassade, pas uniquement l'ambassade de France, mais toutes les ambassades sont au courant. Ils sont au courant. Alors, après, on commence à vous prévenir, oui, faites attention, vous commencez maintenant trop vous rapprocher de tel ou tel pays, patati patata, bon, on va vous couper le crédit. Vous savez, c'est toujours comme ça, on va vous couper le crédit.
Film tourné par les opérateurs de l'armée française, on voit plutôt un peuple silencieux, sans enthousiasme et abasourdi par ce luxe napoléonien qui lui est étranger. Un peuple vaguement inquiet qui remue les petits drapeaux centrafricains sans conviction et qui se fait frapper par les militaires dès qu'ils rompent l'alignement. Malgré ses déclarations sur l'amour que lui porte son peuple, Bokassa n'est pas très tranquille. En plus de la garde impériale qui défile ici pour la galerie en veste verte à épaulettes jaunes et aigle impérial sur le couvre-chef, l'empereur peut compter sur ses soldats en tenue léopard, pistolets aux côtés, fusils mitrailleurs à la main et plus loin, que l'on découvre subrepticement, des centaines d'hommes et des automitrailleuses prêts à surgir en cas de besoin. Il est 11 h quand le cortège parvient enfin devant le palais du couronnement, qui n'arrive pas vraiment à cacher qu'il fut hier palais des sports.
Bokassa, premier empereur de Centrafrique.
Devant les images du couronnement de ce Napoléon noir, le monde hésite entre consternation et éclat de rire. Les humoristes s'en donnent à cœur joie et la caricature de l'Afrique au relent raciste s'en trouve souvent confortée.
Nous sommes à moitié contents, je le disais tout à l'heure à l'intervention de midi, parce que vous le constaterez qu'aucun d'entre nous n'a été invité au sacre de l'empereur Bokassa.
C'est injuste.
C'est injuste, et pourtant nous avions préparé quelque chose pour lui. Dans la fièvre, j'avais été chargé par le gouvernement du Centrafrique de composer l'hymne du couronnement, et le mien a été refusé. Et c'est cette raison pour laquelle nous ne sommes pas invités, mais nous allons quand même le chanter. Si vous voulez bien, pour la première et la dernière fois, je ne comprends pas pourquoi ils nous ont coupé cette chanson qui était pourtant, vous voyez, très très simple, qui était un hymne à l'empereur Bokassa, qui, je vous souviens, a été couronné ce matin. On y va si vous voulez. On fait ce qu'on peut, hein. Dans les rues de Bangui, tout le monde est ravi, et la foule en délire. Faites le premier empire, il est beau, beau, beau. Il est caca, il est beau caca. Il est beau caca, il est beau cassa. Il est beau cassa. Deuxième couplet. Dans les prisons de Bangui, tout le monde est puni. On a coupé les oreilles à ceux qui ont chanté cette merveille. Il est beau, beau, beau. Il est caca, il est beau caca. Il est beau caca. Il est beau cassa. Il est beau cassa. Allez, encore une fois.
Toutes les conclusions que ce rapport aperçoit.
À l'Assemblée, le ministre des Affaires étrangères, Jean-François Poncet, menace.
Lorsque la lumière sera faite, en toute objectivité, la France, avec efficacité et discrétion, respectueuse de la souveraineté de tous les États, usera de l'influence dont elle dispose pour faire respecter les droits de l'homme.
Les jours du dernier empereur d'Afrique sont comptés. En septembre 1979, Giscard, profitant d'un séjour de l'empereur en Libye, donne le feu vert aux parachutistes français stationnés au Tchad pour renverser le régime. Nom de code, Opération Barracuda. La monumentale statue de bronze de l'empereur est brisée par la foule et conduite au cimetière où on la jette dans une fosse commune.
Pour la population, le soulagement et la haine. Bokassa est d'ores et déjà condamné à mort. Le président Dako apporte confirmation. Le trône du palais impérial bientôt renversé.
Qui est mon adversaire? Mon véritable adversaire. Il n'a pas de nom, pas de visage, pas de parti. Et pourtant, il gouverne. Cet adversaire, c'est le monde de la finance. Cet adversaire, c'est le monde de la finance.
Qui avait enchanté les militants socialistes tout en laissant perplexes les banquiers de la City. Mais hier, dans le journal anglais The Guardian, François Hollande s'adoucissait. Aujourd'hui, il n'y a pas de communistes en France. La gauche a gouverné pendant 15 ans, pendant lesquels elle a libéralisé l'économie et ouvert les marchés à la finance et à la privatisation.
En cherchant bien, ils ont trouvé des noms, ils ont trouvé des visages, mais ils ont surtout aussi décidé que c'était pas un adversaire.